just gonna move this closer to me. Thank you so much for having me. And just give me a holler if I need to speak up a bit. I'll try to project as best as I can. So yes, my name is Emmy. I'm a wildlife biologist, and my experience lies in beach nesting birds. I got started as a seasonal technician at Forsyth monitoring piping plovers and fell in love with it. And then a couple years ago, I switched over to the Delaware Bay. So that's where I am now. And I'm excited to share with you a new project that we're working on. So just raise your hand if you've seen an American oystercatcher in the wild before. I'm going to assume most people have, but maybe a few haven't. So I am going to go into a little bit of explanation about them. They're just a beautiful shorebird. They're unmistakable. If you see it on the beach, you know exactly what it is. You can't really confuse it for anything except maybe a black skimmer, but black skimmers have very tiny legs. So it's really an American oystercatcher. They have that striking yellow eye and that carrot color beak, a black head, brown mantle, white underparts, and these long pale pink legs. It's a pretty large shorebird compared to others, around 600 grams. So they're big, they're very loud, they're boisterous, they have lots of personality. And their bill really does come in handy. They are called oystercatchers for a reason. They are one of the only shorebirds to specialize on marine mollusks. So that's like clams, mussels, oysters, as their name implies. And their bill is laterally compressed, which enables it to kind of act like a shucking tool where they can break into a clam or a mussel and get the animal inside. So they do like to eat oysters, like these oyster beds here, but they will eat anything really they can get their hands on. This is an oystercatcher that's picking snails off of a horseshoe crab shell. So they are a bit opportunistic, but they really do specialize on those mollusks. Where can you find them in the US? Pretty much up and down the East Coast. They breed all the way up to Maine, kind of. There's like one or two pairs there. And then all the way down to Florida and even on the Gulf Coast. Their migration does vary, but for the most part, you're not going to see them in the winter north of New Jersey. We are kind of the northernmost limit of their wintering range, but more recently, there's been some birds hanging out in New York during the winter. And because they do eat those marine bivalves, they are restricted to coastal habitats, but they can use a variety of coastal habitats. So you'll find them on barrier islands, most commonly around the Jersey Shore and those ocean beaches, bay beaches, salt marshes, shell rakes, and even on rooftops. So believe it or not, there's a decent number of pairs that nest on Atlantic City rooftops. And they are pretty successful, so it's very surprising. So here's an example of some different habitats. This is a rooftop in Florida. You can kind of see the part of the building here, and it's a gravel rooftop, so it's appealing to the oystercatchers. Here's some oystercatchers foraging in a salt marsh, and then this is a shell rake, and right here, very camouflaged, is an oystercatcher nest. So a little bit about their life history, their breeding season. In March, the breeding adults will arrive onto their breeding grounds. They are highly territorial, so they will discern where their territory is and they will defend it from other oystercatchers. They are unique in that they have a very strong site fidelity, which means they return to the same spot year after year, almost to the exact piece of beach. So they have a very, very good memory. So they will form a pair bond every year. They don't necessarily mate for life, but because they have strong site fidelity, more often than not, the same birds are going to go to the same place and they'll continue that pair bond. But they are known to switch partners. In April and May, they will have their peak egg laying time. They are ground nesters, so they lay their eggs right on the ground, whether that be on sand or salt marsh or shells. But you can see that their eggs are designed to blend in with the sand. They're highly camouflaged. But the male, all he has to do to make a nest is to scrape in the sand, and the female will choose which one she wants, and then she'll lay the eggs. The average clutch size is 3 eggs. They lay an egg pretty much every other day until they reach full clutch, and they'll share incubation duties for around 27 days. In May and June, the chicks will start to hatch for the most part. They are unique in that they are semi-precocial. So maybe you've heard of piping plovers. Once they hatch, after a couple hours, they're able to leave the nest and they can feed themselves. Oystercatchers are similar in that they will start to leave the nest after a couple hours from hatching, but they rely on their parents to feed them because they do not yet have the knowledge or the strength in their bills to break open into those clams and mussels and oysters. As you can see, they are highly camouflaged. They need to blend in with their surroundings because there are predators around. They need to hide, and they are on the move. So their main method of defense, if there's a threat in the area, they will hunker down, they'll hide behind a pile of wrack or some vegetation, and it's really hard to find them. And the adults are very good parents. They're helicopter parents. They'll see a threat, they'll warn the chicks, they'll tell them please go hide, and then they'll lead the predators away from the chicks. Chicks will fledge generally in July and August. It takes around 35 days for them to fledge, and fledging just means they are old enough and developed enough to fly on their own. Although oystercatchers do mooch off of their parents for a while, they'll stay with them for at least a month after fledging, and that's because the parents are teaching them how to forage. And if you are out and you see them in the wild, you can actually discern which is the juvenile and which is the adult, because the juvenile will take some years to get the coloration, the same coloration as the adult. So the juvenile will have a black tip bill and a dark eye compared to the adult's yellow eye and bright bill. It takes them around 3 years before they reach sexual maturity and come back to make their own families. As I mentioned, they are highly territorial during the breeding season, but after the breeding season is over, they become a lot more friendly, and they'll congregate in large flocks that we call roosts, and they will stage in locations together. They'll forage and sleep together, and then during the winter, they will either migrate south or in New Jersey. Some stay in New Jersey year-round, so it really depends on the bird. So what threatens oystercatchers? A lot, unfortunately. They are a coastal species, so that means they overlap with a lot of our coastal recreation. Human disturbance is a huge threat to oystercatchers. If humans are around where oystercatchers are nesting and raising their young, it can cause the oystercatchers to either abandon their nests or their chicks, and that's not great, or it just takes away space for them to nest. So there's literally no space for oystercatchers here in this picture. And that's why if you go to some Atlantic coast beaches and you see roped off areas, that's just an effort to give these birds more space. Predators is another really big one. So they have a lot of predators that affect their eggs and themselves and their chicks. Mammalian predators like foxes, possums, raccoons, minks, coyote, anything, feral cats. Avian predators, owls, peregrine falcons, crows will eat the eggs. So lots of threats out there. And then another huge one is habitat loss. So we are in New Jersey. It's a highly developed state, especially on the shore. As we develop more, we lose more habitat. And this is only worsened by sea level rise. And because of all of those threats, in New Jersey, oystercatchers are listed as a species of special concern, which the definition is those species that warrant special attention because of evidence of decline, inherent vulnerability to environmental deterioration, or habitat modification that would result in becoming a threatened species. So they're not at the same conservation concern as a bird like the piping plover, for example, but they are inherently vulnerable to changes in coastal resources. So that brings us into their management in New Jersey. We have been managing oystercatchers in New Jersey since 2003, so quite a while. And this happened because there was a range-wide census that found that only 11,000 oystercatchers were in the range on the East Coast, and that was a problem. So we formed a group called the American Oystercatcher Working Group, and the whole goal is to bring that population back up. So in New Jersey, we monitor mostly the ocean nesting population, and there's intensive monitoring on the Atlantic coast beaches. However, it's estimated that over half of the statewide population does not use those beaches for nesting. They use alternative habitats like the ones I was talking about before, including salt marshes and bay beaches. So really, we don't have the full picture of the status of American oystercatchers in our state. So that brought us to the question, what about the Delaware Bay population? We have this huge bayshore coastline in New Jersey, and no one really has been looking at it for oystercatchers until now. So now we're gonna switch over to the other Jersey shore. Hopefully, maybe some of you have visited the other Jersey shore, which I call Delaware Bay. Most commonly known for migratory shorebirds in the spring. So the red knot is a really popular bird that people like to see during May and June. A lot of the bay beaches are closed during the 3 weeks that the birds are visiting. And of course, they're visiting to feast on horseshoe crab eggs. We have the highest concentration of spawning horseshoe crabs on the Delaware Bay. It's an amazing phenomenon. I highly suggest you go see it. And it attracts all of these migratory shorebirds. So they get all the attention.
Can you point out the East Point Lighthouse? Oh, that's that slide.
Oh, yep. But oystercatchers are here too. And this is the East Point Lighthouse. It is the second oldest lighthouse in New Jersey, and I think the only remaining bay lighthouse.
Now it's threatened.
Yes, there's a big story behind that. I won't get into that, but it is still there. You can still see it. You just can't go in it at this point. So how did we get to this point? In 2016, Conserve Wildlife Foundation confirmed that oystercatchers were nesting on the bayshore, and then we conducted a small pilot survey of just a couple pairs, and we decided that we had to survey the whole bay. So in 2021, we did a near bay-wide census to kind of get an estimate of how many pairs we were looking at. And we found 13 pairs at 8 sites. And once we found that many pairs, we were like, we should get some funding and try to monitor them. So we applied to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for funding. We joined a partnership, so Conserve Wildlife is leading it, but the Wetlands Institute and U.S. Fish and Wildlife are our partners. We received that funding and we started our monitoring in 2023. We just wrapped up our 2024 season, and good news, we have 3 more years of funding that just got approved, so we're gonna continue doing it. Yeah. And we have 4 main questions and goals for this project. And we're going into this thinking we don't know anything about these birds, so these are a little bit basic. First one, how many nesting pairs are on the bay and where are they on the bay? 2, what is their nesting habitat like? Can we create new nesting habitat for them? 3, are they productive? What threatens their success? And 4, how do they move around the bayshore and where do they migrate? So I'm going to talk about each of these goals one at a time. First one, how many nesting pairs are there and where are they? We find this out by conducting pretty intensive census surveys. So in 2023, our monitoring began in April. We had a basic idea of where a few pairs were located from our previous census survey in 2021, but we had to fill in all the gaps. So we surveyed 35 sites from Sunset Beach and Cape May Point all the way up to Seabreeze during a 15-day window in May. And we found 19 pairs at 11 sites and 1 suspected nesting pair at an additional site. We're going to repeat this in 2025, and it's going to be a biannual survey from here on out. And I put a picture of a kayak here because if you're familiar with the Delaware Bay, you will know that most of the sites you can't get to by foot. So we did a lot of kayaking and a lot of boating, put in a lot of miles, but it was totally worth it. So here's our map of all the sites. It's around 30 miles of bayshore that we covered. And you'll see every orange dot is a site that had at least 1 nesting pair. This is in 2023. And you'll notice that there's a pretty decent concentration of orange dots around the Morris River. We've found most of our pairs were nesting there. This is 2024. We added some more sites that had nesting pairs, but for the most part, they still were concentrated in that area. So now we have a basic idea of how many pairs there are. We're hovering at around 19 or 20, and we know where they are. Now, what is their nesting habitat like? We are conducting habitat research and restoration to find out. So a little bit of background, in case you don't understand by now, the Delaware Bay is pretty different than the ocean beach, right? So ocean beaches are wider, they have higher energy, really big, strong waves, and they have large elevated dunes. Delaware Bay beaches are much narrower, They are lower energy and low elevation. They're also right up against marshes for the most part. So they're at risk of lots of flooding from the bay and from behind in the marsh. So they get hit by both sides. So our goal is to identify, maintain, and enhance the high-quality nesting habitat for oystercatchers on the bayshore. We're doing a variety of different things. So one of the most important things is that we are measuring the elevation at every single nest site to get an idea of where the oystercatchers are nesting, what elevation they like to nest at, and which elevations are maybe not as successful. So maybe they are flooding more often. We are studying every single nest site. So there's some eggs right here, and this is a quadrat. So we're just measuring the substrate type and the distance to the marsh, distance to foraging habitat, basically all these characteristics that maybe we can find a pattern for, and data analysis is still ongoing. And then we're also examining some invasive species removal. So this is kind of a touchy topic, but maybe you've heard of Phragmites. It is an invasive reed plant. It is literally everywhere, and it takes over areas very quickly, forming monocultures. So you can see here, this is the main stand of the Phragmites, and it's spreading out its rhizomes. And this stake represents the location of a nest in 2024. And this was taken in August of 2024, so a couple months later. And you can see that the frag has already started to encroach on that nesting habitat because the oystercatchers would like all this open, sandy area. So this is a problem. So what we're doing is we are experimenting with some very targeted herbicide treatment at high priority nesting sites. And we are tracking the success using photo stations. So it's a picture of the same location year after year to look at the difference. So this is an example of a photo station just after treatment, and we're only focusing on these little Phragmites stems. This is that same location a year after treatment. So you can see the native vegetation is remaining, but the Phragmites has cleared out, which is encouraging. So we're still working on that, and we'll have the results soon. The whole goal of this is to incorporate what we find into a more holistic bay-wide restoration effort on the Delaware Bay. Right now, a lot of focus has been to restoring the beaches post-Hurricane Sandy, putting a bunch of sand replenishment and maybe installing living shorelines to kind of soften that wave energy. And that's all to benefit horseshoe crabs and red knots. We're hoping we can kind of get our foot in the door and say, okay, how about you add these elevations? Because oystercatchers really like these elevations and they're less likely to flood. So how can we incorporate oystercatchers into the plan? Great, number 3, are oystercatchers productive on the Delaware Bay? What are their threats? This is the most fun part for me. This is the nitty-gritty in the field nest and brood monitoring. So we monitor productivity by nest searching. It's not that hard to do on the bayshore. There's only so much beach for them to nest on, but you still have to find the nests and check on their status once, up to 3 times a week, but usually once a week. We have to record the nest fate, so whether they hatched or failed, and if they did fail, what caused their loss. If they happen to hatch, which is great, we monitor the chicks throughout their life cycle up to the point where they fledge. So our whole goal is to come up with this productivity number, and that's just defined as the number of fledglings per pair. And our goal that's set by the Oystercatcher Working Group is 0.5 chicks per pair. That may not make sense to you, because why would half a chick be good? But it turns out it's fine because these species, they're very long-lived species. They can live for up to 20 years or more. So you don't need as many fledglings to keep the population going. And this is an example of how brood searching can be hard. This is a little chick that's nestled in a pile of rack, which is easy to see when I point it out to you and it's zoomed in, but try looking at that chick from 100 meters away. It's a lot harder. This is an example of my favorite nest, which was in an oystercatcher shell, which is very Delaware Bay. And this is an example of some of the symbolic fencing that we install around the nest to kind of minimize disturbance. And I also mentioned that it's really hard to get to some of these sites. We have to kayak to a lot of them, which means we can't be there very often. The bay is really hard to kayak in. And so we really rely on game cameras as passive monitoring tools. And these are fantastic because we can set them up and leave them. They last all season, and they can help us verify nest fate, pinpoint causes of losses, record predators, and document any other disturbances that we might not be able to witness. So here's some highlight reels. If this works, this is a good camera sighting where you have chicks hatching. So this is right during the hatch, and this is great because this helps us verify that the chicks did hatch. And we know that 2 of them hatched. And so when we see this on camera, it's very exciting, very happy. Here's another example. So once they hatch, they get right on the move. So if we can get them in frame, that's fantastic. So we have 1, 2, 3 chicks verified that they hatched. Great. Now the not so great stuff. So we did record lots of flooding, lots of predation. So red fox is one of our main predators on the bay shore. They're responsible for a lot of my anguish. But yes, raccoons were a big one in 2024. So here's one eating 2 eggs. American mink is also very common because they're semi-aquatic and they do come from the marshes. So this was an interesting story. This mink came to this nest in the middle of the night and handled the eggs, but didn't actually eat any of them. So we thought that was weird, and our theory is that it was waiting for them to hatch because they prefer to eat chicks. So that was a weird one. Avian predators, so this is a great horned owl, and they will predate the oystercatcher chicks. Another one, which was kind of a surprise, peregrine falcons. The eggs are right here. We had, I'm not sure if this is the right one, but we did have a banded peregrine falcon. I was hoping to capture the bands on camera, but no luck. And they will eat the chicks and the adults. Some other disturbances. So this is unfortunately a human getting really close to a nest. And I like to look at this in a positive way and say, okay, maybe we can focus outreach here because maybe this person doesn't know what's going on. Sorry?
Is there a nest there?
Yes, so it's behind, you can't see it, it's right there. Some kind of funny disturbances. So this was, the nest is around here. This was a poor pair that was terrorized by a family of geese every single day. And this is a problem because if the birds can't incubate the eggs, how are they going to develop? So these disturbances are keeping the birds off of the eggs and preventing them from hatching. Bald eagles were such an unexpected, but in hindsight should have been an expected threat on the Bay Shore. Cumberland County has the highest concentration of eagle nests, so of course they're going to be on Delaware Bay beaches. We witnessed plenty of sparring wars between oystercatchers and bald eagles. So here you can see this one, it's a crazy picture, and then 2 eagles in the background as well. At the most, I think we had 9 eagles on camera at this site, so crazy. Here's a beautiful juvenile eagle standing right in front of the nest, taking a selfie. And of course, the oystercatchers are nowhere to be found. Another one, an adult eagle, here's the nest, and the oystercatcher is trying to defend it. Another juvenile watching. And then this is a weird story. This was the same nest that I mentioned. The mink approached it and handled the eggs, but did not eat them. I checked this nest in the field a few days later, and one of the eggs was missing, and there were mink tracks going up to the nest, so I said, okay, finally, he ate the egg. But I reviewed the camera footage, and it was a different story. So this is kind of a time lapse, so pay attention. Focus your attention to where the eggs are, which is where the arrow is pointing, and you'll see there's an eagle standing right over the nest right now. So I never could have predicted this, but 2 juvenile eagles started carrying this log. One of them carried it over the nest, knocked an egg out, puncturing it, and then stood over the egg saying, oh, maybe I didn't mean that to happen, but just watched it. And then the adults, if the eggs are broken, they will remove the eggshells to keep them away as to not to attract predators. So I never would have guessed that. I would have assumed it was the mink if not for these cameras, which is why they're so important. So some data. All right, so this is 2023. We had 19 nesting pairs as a reminder. 2023 was a good year. It gave us some false hope. So we had very high pair hatch success. Almost 50% of our pairs managed to hatch chicks, which is great. But we had low chick survival. Of 20 known chicks, only 4 survived to fledge, which is very low, and it's not expected for that species. Typically, it's very hard for them to hatch nests, but when they do, they're very good at keeping their chicks protected and feeding them, and they're more likely to fledge. So this was the opposite in what we were used to seeing. In 2023, our productivity was 0.2 fledglings per pair. As a reminder, our goal is 0.5. It's lower than 0.5, and it was also lower than the state's productivity, which was 0.32. So what was causing the losses? Mostly predation, but less than we expected based on all the predators we captured on camera. And our main predator was just red fox, with the exception of that eagle that did happen to destroy a nest. The other causes were flooding and abandonment. And as I mentioned before, the oystercatchers are concentrating in this section of the bayshore near the Morris River. Around 60% of our pairs are there. And in 2023, those pairs were the most successful compared to the other regions of the bayshore. 2024 was a very different story. We went down 1 pair. We had 18 nesting pairs, but we increased our number of sites to 13. They're still concentrated in that region though. There was a significant decrease in hatch success. So in 2023, we had 36% of nests hatching. 2024, around 10%. We only had 3 nests hatch. It was very depressing. But out of the nests that did hatch, they were pretty successful in fledging. We had 5 chicks and 2 of them fledged, which is pretty comparable to 2023 when we had 4 fledge. But our productivity was very low, still 0.11 fledglings per pair. New Jersey as a whole in 2024 did great. They went over 0.5 fledglings per pair. So we are not performing as well on the bayshore. And why is that? Predation. This was a different story in 2024. The predators stayed away in 2023, but they did not stay away this year. So 68% of our failed nests were predated. And the culprits varied this time. So we had red fox, mink, raccoon, and mystery mammals. So this was the big change from last year. And we only have 2 years of data, so we can't form any kind of conclusions about what is really threatening them on the bayshore, which is why we are continuing the project for 3 more years to hopefully find some trends and some patterns. So hopefully 2024 was a dud, but the predator community is not encouraging. All right, so another really fun part of this project, we are tracking how oystercatchers move around the bayshore by bird banding and telemetry. So this might be exciting, especially to birders, because we really rely on your help for resites for these birds. So why do we band birds? This is a long-standing tradition in the bird world. There have been banding stations that have been around for decades. It's very common. It's a great way to collect long-term data and track individual birds. Oystercatchers in New Jersey are equipped with field-readable bands. So they are made of plastic, they're put on the upper leg, and they have unique alphanumeric codes, kind of like a name tag, that you can see in the field if you have really good binoculars or a scope or a really nice camera. So that's able to tell us the individual. They also have a federal band on their lower leg. We also take measurements during every banding session. So we measure their bill length, their weight, variety of different measurements, And this is great because we've collected so much data over the years that we now know that there's differences in their measurements between males and females. So females have a longer bill and they weigh more. So if we have the bird in hand, we're more likely to be able to sex it in the field, which is great. We do name our birds on the Delaware Bay. So we have Schooner here, Della's mate is Bay for Delaware Bay, and Crouton. So some of them are meaningful, some of them are silly, like Crouton. And we're doing this so we can track if they're going back to the same place every year, the same mate, and where they migrate. How do we capture them? We use a variety of methods. So we can either target incubating adults. We set up a bow net. So it's kind of folded back like a taco. And the real eggs are removed and fake eggs are put in their spot so as not to risk breaking them. The adults will return to incubate the fake eggs, and once it's settled, this is trigger operated and the nest will fold over them, and it enables us to retrieve them. Another way is to target them using noose carpets. So here it's hard to see, but these are wire carpets and they have fishing lines that are tied into little nooses, and we set up decoys and fake eggs and we play oystercatcher sounds. Oystercatchers are protective of their nest. They will go to approach the decoys, they'll walk on the mats and their feet will get stuck. And then very quickly you can go and retrieve them. For chicks, it's much easier, they can't fly. So we use chick corrals, which is when you set up kind of a wall of netting and then you just gently guide them towards it and you can pick them up. Or if you're lucky, you'll be able to spot them. You know their location and you can walk towards them. Their mechanism for defense is just to sit down. So you just walk up, pick them up, and that's it. Easy. Much easier to get a chick than an adult. So far, we have around 40% of our adult population banded over 2 years, which is great. It's been a struggle on the Delaware Bay. A lot of them are pretty skittish and they don't want to go back to the very obvious traps that you set out. But we have 15 fledged adults and 4 fledged chicks that are banded. We had 2 that were already banded in the population before we started this project. One was a bird named Evermore. She was banded in 2018 at Moores Beach, hence the name Evermore. She's been there ever since. Alfredog was a weird one. He popped up in 2023 at Moores Beach, but we looked at his records and found out that he was hatched at Holgate over at Edwin B. Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge in 2019. So that already provides evidence that we have some interchange between the ocean and the Delaware Bay. Unfortunately, his nest was destroyed by an eagle, and he has not been back since. Since we have some banded birds, we're able to collect some data about their migration. We already know a few things about the species based on other data. We know that their migration is highly variable. So around half of oystercatchers breeding from New Jersey to North Carolina don't migrate at all. They'll stay put year-round in their area. We know that this is kind of true because we have Evermore, who, based on our resites, stays in New Jersey year-round. She hangs out at Hereford Inlet, so North Wildwood and Stone Harbor Point. We also know that around 40% of our northeast breeding population winters on the northwest coast of Florida, particularly Cedar Key. They really like it there. We have evidence for that because of Alfredog. Alfredog winters at Cedar Key. And then we do know that members of family groups migrate independently from each other. They don't take the same family vacation. So we do have a banded family unit. Evermore, Moby, and Schooner, Moby and Schooner were banded in 2023. They all go to different places for the winter. So Schooner was seen in North Carolina, Moby was seen in Old Tampa Bay, Florida, and Evermore hangs out in New Jersey. So completely different. This is my shameless public service announcement to you guys. If you happen to be birding and you see a banded oystercatcher, please report it. It's so valuable to get the data from the public. You can report it very easily to the American Oystercatcher Working Group. They have a super user-friendly form to collect that data. This is just showing that there's different configurations for oystercatcher bands. We have a vertical configuration, triangular, and horizontal, and different colors. And that's all based on the state in which they were banded. So if you see orange bands, that means they were banded in New Jersey or New York. Really want to know who they are. But any band is good. And I'll leave this up at the end, but this is a working QR code to take you to the working group's website. So this is brand new in 2024, really exciting. We started using GPS telemetry to track these birds. So banding is only as good as the resites that you're getting, which often is not a lot, maybe 1 or 2 a year, depending on how commonly they're seen or where they are, if they're in a public area or they're very remote. GPS transmitters, on the other hand, can collect data constantly. So we have them collecting data every 30 minutes, and it works the same way as your phone. If you're trying to locate where you are using Google Maps, it's collecting satellite data to pinpoint your location. So we do equip birds with transmitters. I have an example of one right here. They're tiny, lightweight, and they wear them for up to 3 years and collect tons of data. And one of the questions we're trying to answer is their foraging range. We know that birds have to collect food for their offspring to feed them. There is a working theory that birds that have to travel farther to forage have less fledgling success because they're spending more time looking for food instead of taking care of their offspring. So here's an example of some transmitter data in North Carolina. All these pink dots are an adult that's staying very close to its brood location, and all these yellow dots from another bird that's moving all over to collect food for the brood. So it's just to give you an idea of how that might differ. So we're kind of curious if the Delaware Bay is showing one of those patterns. Do they have to go pretty far to get food, or do they have plenty of food right there? And is that affecting their success? And we're supplementing that with some diet studies. So we're just going out in the field and ground truthing. We're watching them eat and recording how many times they provision their chick. So how do we equip these oyster catchers? We have to capture them, and then a very experienced biologist will put the harness on. It goes over their legs, and they kind of wear it like a backpack. And we fit it very carefully so that it does not impact the bird's flight. Turns out it's very hard to find birds that are heavy enough to carry them. The total harness cannot take up more than 3% of their body weight, and this is only 12, 13 grams, but that's a lot for a bird. So we only found 2 birds that were heavy enough to carry them this year. This is a little schematic of how it works. So the bird is wearing the transmitter. The transmitter communicates with the satellite and stores GPS information every 30 minutes. Once the transmitter can communicate with a cell tower, so like Verizon or AT&T, it will dump all those locations on the internet, send it straight to our computers and our phones. So it's very easy, and we don't even have to go in the field to look for them. We get all the locations right on the computer. I just want to shout out our supporters for the transmitter aspect of this project. They were generously donated by the Cape May Point Science Center, which is a brand new nonprofit that started in Cape May Point. Highly suggest you visit. It's in the old St. Mary's Convent Retreat Center. It's also a beautiful location. And then Cellular Tracking Technologies is the provider of the transmitter. And the Wetlands Institute equips them for us. So here are our birds. This is Snowflower. She is a female, and she was tagged while tending an active nest, which is interesting data for us. Later in the season, we were able to tag Roy Royster. He's a male, and he was tagged while tending his brood. He had 1 chick. And this was so exciting because, like I said, only 3 nests hatch in 2024. And this was our only chick at the time. So we were like, yes, he's heavy enough to carry it. We can track how far he's going to collect food for his young. So a little bit of the data. This is Snowflower's range while her nest was active. So she was nesting at South Goshen, and this cluster right here is where her nest is. And you can see that while she was tending her nest, she didn't go very far. Maybe a couple foraging trips here, but for the most part stayed nice and close to incubate and protect her eggs. Her nest was predated a few days or a week or so after we tagged her. In the time after her nest was no longer active, her range expanded quite significantly. So she was using pretty much all of the Bay Shore. She went all the way up to Egg Island and all the way down to Delhaven and Cape May. And she really liked some oyster beds in Bay Cove and Rutgers. They have an experimental lab out there with lots of oyster beds. And so she really liked those foraging areas. So we were able to pinpoint those locations. This is Roy Royster. This was an interesting story because we deployed his transmitter, and after day one, it never dumped any locations. So we thought it was dead, and we were very upset about it because we didn't want the bird to carry a transmitter without actually collecting data. Fast forward to September, he turned up in Virginia and dumped all the locations. So it had stored all the locations, and we had a heart attack because we were like, oh my God, he's in Virginia. But our theory is that there's no cell service where he's nesting. So it's just, it can't communicate with the cell towers and can't get us the locations. But now we know for next season. So after we got those locations, we were able to map some of them out. This is his range while he was brooding his chick, Rudy. And this was his foraging range we confirmed with our in the field observations. He stayed very close to his chick for the most part, which is what we would expect if there's good food around, right? After Rudy had fledged and was able to fly on his own, his range expanded to include some other sites. So he went up to Money Island to forage, but also stayed in the area. And he even did some trips down to Egg Island. So this suggests at a very base level that there might be good food where he was raising his chick, and that could confer that fledge success, because Rudy did end up fledging. And some wintering behavior. So this is what I was talking about. He showed up in Virginia on the eastern shore in September. We were very excited to see that. He's hanging out by Wacapreag, and he really likes these bay shore or salt marsh sites. And also this little island over here. Snowflower is a little bit different. She's still hanging out on the Cape May Peninsula, and she travels back and forth between Hereford Inlet, so Stone Harbor Point, and the bay. So she's still going in between those two sides of the peninsula. But she also threw us for a loop, and she went for a weekend trip down to Virginia. And she spent 2 days there, decided it wasn't for her, and flew right back to New Jersey. So we thought she was gonna winter there, and nope, she's back in Stone Harbor Point now. But ironically, she went to the same exact place where Roy is. So maybe they just wanted to check up on each other. We don't know. So this is just a little bit of some of the data that we're collecting and what we can learn from it. What are our next steps? As I mentioned, we have renewed funding for the next 3 years through NIFWIF, or National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We're going to be continuing monitoring and ramping up our banding, more telemetry, more habitat analysis, and hopefully more diet analysis. So please stay tuned for updates. You can look at our website, conservewildlifenj.org, I think. We're launching a new website. And we will be releasing a story map that's going to be public, and it has all this really cool data and a lot of the images that I showed today. Please check it out. I'll send it to whoever when it is released. And if you're wondering if there's anything you can do to support us, very basic behavior with beach nesting birds. If you're going to the beach, remember to share the shore and give birds their space. Respect the symbolic fencing, which I'm sure all of you guys do. You're very conscientious. And keep out of fenced areas. Leave dogs at home if you can, or at least leash them. Report banded birds, and spread the word. Because I think not everyone knows that there's oystercatchers on the Bay Shore, so definitely spread the word. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll be here after as well if anyone wants to chat. So thank you. I promised I would leave that one slide up with the QR code, so I'll get that. Yes, question? Yes.
You said when you harness the birds and you monitor them for 3 years, what happens to the harness after there's no longer any data?
So it stays on them, but our goal and our top priority is to recapture them and take it off. And for the most part, that's easy to do because they will fall for the same trap. multiple times. Yeah. So after it stops collecting, we will go in the field and collect the harness.
Do you think that temperature changes are pushing predator populations from the north down, perhaps?
I think the problem is that the predators are always there. So a lot of the predators we're facing are mammalian predators that are in coastal areas because of human development. They've learned to live alongside humans, and I'm talking about red fox, coyote, raccoons. They benefit from our presence. We leave trash, we have shelter, and historically these predators were not in coastal areas, because how would they survive in those coastal areas? So now it's just a problem that they're here, and oystercatchers and other beach nesting birds are not necessarily evolved to protect against them because they lay their eggs on the ground. They're evolved to defend against avian predators that can't see the nest from the sky. So that's the issue. They're here year round, and predator control is a hot topic. It's something that oftentimes we need to do to create some semblance of a balance in the ecosystem. But I don't know, and maybe someone knows more than me about temperature changes driving those predators.
It sounds like you think it's habitat encroachment that's the problem.
I think human development has caused a lot of issues indirectly and directly. Just over time, we have created a new natural ecosystem, which is just predators around. We reintroduced peregrine falcons to ocean areas, and now peregrine falcons are preying on oystercatchers, when traditionally they nest in cliffs. So it's just, we have intervened, and there are some consequences.
Is their longevity, is that unusual for like similar birds, seabirds?
So comparatively, a piping plover will live maybe the same age as a dog at the most. Like piping plovers maybe go for 6 or 7 years. Oystercatchers are very long-lived, and that is pretty unusual. Mm-hmm. We caught one this fall, or this spring, that was over 20 years old, and its federal ban had worn, like the letters were all worn, so we had to like do some digging to figure out who it was, but it was really cool.
How long will they breed?
Sorry?
How long will they breed?
All the way up, yep. That bird was successful, and the older they get, the more they learn, and the better parents they are.
Do they just lay eggs once a year, one time a year? Or?
Oh, I should have mentioned that. So they do lay eggs once a year on the East Coast from April to the cutoff is like July. But if they lay a nest and it's eaten or it's flooded out, they will repeat a clutch. And they will keep trying and trying until they literally run out of energy. So I've seen birds that have tried 4 times in a season. And that's just very energetically demanding, and oftentimes they won't create the same number of eggs. So the more clutches they have, the fewer eggs.
Do the young ones that fledge, do they come back to those same spots when they 3 years later?
That's what we want to find out. So that's why we're banding the chicks, and we're hoping that we'll be able to capture some resites. It does take them around 3 years to either return to their natal area or find a new one. So we won't know if they are returning to breed for at least another 2 years, because we started banding in 2023. But yeah, some of them do and some of them don't. They're very variable. Mm-hmm.
Do you use volunteers to help monitor that? And if so, where do you sign up?
We try. It is so hard on the Bayshore to access these sites that it's hard to get volunteers like to actually go out there if you don't have a kayak or a boat or an off-road vehicle that can travel down Moores Beach Road. If you've ever seen that road, it's impossible to get down, and it's a 30-minute walk if you're not driving. So it's possible, it's just very limited in what you're able to do. So it depends on your threshold for how rough and tough you want to get. But we do take volunteers, and you can talk to me after if you're interested. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if the birds that wear the transmitter get really buff. Do you expect those transmitters to get lighter with the improvements in technology and being
Yes.
able to use them more?
They already have. So the one that we have here, which is around 12 grams, it's it's not obsolete, but there's already a new one to replace it that's a lot lighter. So we're hoping to swap out the remaining ones that we have for the lighter transmitter. And transmitters nowadays, it's amazing what they can do. They're tagging monarch butterflies with transmitters. So that's the weight of like a grain of rice. So the possibilities are endless. It's just technology catching up, which cellular tracking technologies is pushing the boundaries every single year. So yes, hopefully next year we will have lighter ones and we can equip more birds with them.
So every year, our family walks from the end of Cape May Boardwalk along the shore to the lighthouse and back. And we see a lot, and it's usually in May, and we see a lot of pairs. How far apart will they nest, or how much space do they need?
It depends on the site and the birds. Some of them want a lot of space and they'll be really aggressive when defending their territories. Others are a little bit more tolerant of other species being near them. And, you know, there'll be oystercatcher nests in least tern colonies, which is like crazy because least terns are highly defensive, but there is some protection in that because, you know, if someone enters a least tern colony, they're gonna be pooped on and they're gonna walk away. So it depends on the bird, but they do need, I would say, at least 200 meters, if not more. On the bayshore, everyone is spread out enough that they each kind of get their spot. But then you have places like Holgate, which is an ocean barrier island. It's around 3 miles long, and there's 54 pairs of oystercatchers on it. So it's like an apartment complex, or right on top of each other. It all kind of depends. Well, thank you. If anyone has any other questions, talk to me later.